Okay, so by popular demand, I have made another tier list. I had a lot of requests for different tier lists, but I wanted to stick with what I know best first before I sort of move on to other weapon types that might take more research or practice for me to rank on my end. So, a few things before we start. These are only the 140 RPM hand cannons, not 180 or 120s. So if you don't see a gun on the list that you're looking for, make sure it's a 140 because I didn't forget any. I just want to point that out. Also, these are just the non-sunset legendaries. All of the exotics would be S+, so I left them out. Also, these tiers are the weapons compared to themselves, not the game as a whole. Meaning that if I put something in a low tier, I don't think it's a bad weapon overall. 140 RPM hand cannons are a very strong archetype as a whole, so all of these guns will be good. The tiers are just ranking them amongst each other. Okay, with all of the sort of disclaimers out of the way, I want to say that I do have a Discord server that anyone is free to join, as well as a Twitter, and both of those are in the description. Now let's get into the list. First up is the Ancient Gospel from the Garden of Salvation raid. Now, I actually really like this weapon. I don't know why, it's really kind of bad, but I do like it. It has very good perk options, including Rapid Hit Rangefinder or Eye of the Storm Rangefinder. It also can roll Swashbuckler, which I want to point out because I believe you can 2-tap with it if you are Radiant and have Swash ×5. So a throwing knife kill, for example, would let you become Radiant, and then you could run around and 2-tap for a bit. Unless I'm mistaken. I haven't tested this myself because I don't have a Swashbuckler 140, but I have been told that you can do this. Now, there are better weapons on this list that also roll Swashbuckler, so I wouldn't go for this just for that, but I wanted to point it out. Overall, it has a below average range stat and is just greatly outclassed by most of the weapons on this list, so even though I do like it, I'm going to put it in C tier. Next up is the Annual Skate. So I am not a huge fan of this weapon, but it does have some things going for it. It has decent overall stats and a pretty good perk pool. I really like Surplus or Slide Shot in the first perk slot. Now in the second perk slot, it can roll Opening Shot or Timed Payload. Now in my opinion, the only reason to use this gun is to use Timed Payload because otherwise it's severely outclassed by most of the other weapons on this list. It is kind of weird to get used to using time payload because the shots are sort of delayed with the explosions, but if you get used to it, the amount of flinch it deals is actually insane. So I'm going to put this in B tier because I think timed payload sort of bumps it up from C tier, but there are still better options out there. Okay, next up is the popular AUSTRINGER. This can be acquired from focusing engrams in the helm or opening chests on the Leviathan. Now this gun is also craftable, which is a huge deal because you can get the exact roll you want if you are able to grind enough for it. So in my opinion, the first perk slot should definitely be Eye of the Storm. I think it is an S tier perk on hand cannons because in a duel your third shot will always be the hardest to land just due to you getting flinched and your target strafing, and just the fact that you have to land 3 in a row makes the third shot definitely the hardest to hit. So, Eye of the Storm helps you hit this third shot as your health gets lower. Now, due to recent changes, you could also possibly get some value out of Air Assault. It does give plus 10 airborne effectiveness, and I believe plus 70 when you're low health. I think Eye of the Storm is way better overall, but I think Air Assault is at least worth mentioning. Now for the second perk slot, I personally use Rangefinder, but Opening Shot is excellent as well. I think it's sort of just up to your personal preference between the two, but you can't really go wrong with either of those. So I believe AUSTRINGER is S tier. If you wanted to put it in S+, I could see that as well. You'll see later on why I have an S+ tier, but overall I think AUSTRINGER is a top 2 or 3 hand cannon in the game. Next up is the Cantata 57. The Cantata 57 is a world drop that came out with the Witch Queen expansion. Now, I actually really like this weapon, and it does have good enough stats to compete with the other weapons on this list. It is also in the energy slot, which helps a bit since I think most of the better hand cannons are in the kinetic slot for some reason. And I think one of the main downsides to the weapon is that it's nearly impossible to get the roll you want since you can't target farm it and it is just a world drop. This is definitely one of the weapons that should have been craftable in my opinion, so hopefully down the line we'll be able to. Now, as far as perks go, you can get Eye of the Storm or even Rapid Hit in the first slot. I really like Rapid Hit personally, but I'd probably recommend Eye of the Storm overall. In the second perk slot, I'd go with opening shot or rangefinder. Moving target or timed payload are also available, and those are always solid options as well. Overall, this gun has excellent perks and good overall stats, so I'm going to place it in A tier. I do think the S tier weapons are slightly better, but the Cantata can definitely hang with them, so I think A tier is a perfect fit for this weapon. The Crisis Inverted is next and is currently a Crucible drop, so it is very easy to farm, but it has a huge perk pool, so it's still hard to get the exact roll you want. I play a ton of Crucible and I still don't have my ideal roll yet. So the first perk slot contains Rapid Hit and Moving Target. It also gets Under Pressure, which is kind of unique. I don't think it's the best, but it could be fun to mess around with since it's pretty unique to 140s as a whole. In the second slot, I'd probably go with Rangefinder or Opening Shot. Now, one thing I need to point out with this weapon is actually the muzzle flash. I don't know why it does this. It's one of the only guns in the game that I have this issue. Normally this isn't really a Destiny issue, but it does have crazy muzzle flash when you shoot this. It's pretty blinding, honestly. The flashes are annoying and it just makes it way too hard to see your target. Also, another thing is the sights and the weapon will occasionally glow blue. I'm sure it's some sort of perk or maybe like the origin trait or something that's triggering, and I just didn't quite pinpoint what it was. But regardless of what is causing this, I cannot see anything at all when it glows like this, and I don't know why it does this, like I said, but it is not okay. I think this needs to be fixed. You cannot see anything. So overall, this weapon has a below average range stat and some visual issues with the muzzle flash that sort of make it below average in my opinion. Because of this, I'm going to put it in B tier. Honestly, if the muzzle flash thing were to be fixed, I may bump it up to A tier, but until then, it's going to be B tier for me. Next up is the DFA that drops from the Nightfall playlist. That means that this is a weapon with an adept version with access to adept mods. Now, I actually really like this weapon. I think it feels really good to use. A lot of my friends really like it as well. It has some solid stats and solid perks to go with it. I really like Fragile Focus in the first slot, as that's pretty unique to have since it's a new perk, and I believe it's the only 140 that can roll that currently. It also has Perpetual Motion in the first slot, super solid as well. I'd go with Opening Shot in the second column or Timed Payload if you want to go that route. Overall, this is a solid weapon with little downsides. I don't think it's quite as good as some of the others on this list, but it's definitely a solid choice that you can't go wrong with, so I'm going to put it in A tier. Okay, up next is the Dire Promise. Now, I think Dire Promise is a great example of power creep in this game, because it used to be the king of legendary hand cannons in the Crucible, but that is not really the case anymore. I sort of just use it now if I want to use it, not because it'll give me any sort of edge. Most people will use Opening Shot Rangefinder as their role. I think Swashbuckler is decent as well, just because, like I mentioned, when you're Radiant, you can run around and two-tap people with it, so I wouldn't really rely on that, but it's something worth mentioning. It can get Snapshot as well. Overall, this gun is still very good with a high aim assist stat and decent range stat as well, so I'm going to put it in A tier. Next is the Ias Luna from the Grasp of Avarice dungeon. Now this weapon is very similar to AUSTRINGER, as I think AUSTRINGER was originally based off of Ias Luna, if I'm not mistaken. So they're very similar, they look the same pretty much. Since they are quite similar, I'm also going to put Ias Luna in S tier, but I think AUSTRINGER is a bit better, mostly due to the perk pool. Ias Luna really doesn't have the most exciting perks, but Rangefinder is probably the best option for perk 1. I really like Rapid Hit in that first slot as well, and I know some people who really like Perpetual Motion too. The final column could go to Moving Target, but personally, I don't think it's really necessary since the aim assist stat is already so high, especially if you run like a targeting mod on your helmet. I usually use Kill Clip since it's actually not too bad for team shotting and just easier, more consistent 3 taps after you get a kill. Snapshot and Demolitionist are both solid as well. So, like I said, this is going to go in S tier. Okay, next we have the Fatebringer from the Vault of Glass raid. This was brought back from Destiny 1 and is better than ever, at least as far as PvP is concerned. So, Fatebringer has a lot going for it. It has excellent stats, as well as a time loss version, which will grant you access to adept mods. It also has access to what I think are the best 2 hand cannon perks in the game. The first being Eye of the Storm, like I've already mentioned, super important, helps you land your 3rd shot more consistently, which is the hardest to hit when you're in a duel. Now, this is actually the only weapon I'm going to be placing in the S plus tier. This is the reason I have the tier. because I think it is the best legendary 140 RPM hand cannon in the game, and that is because of everything I've mentioned, plus the fact that it gets explosive payload in the first perk slot. I think explosive payload is just insane. The main reason is the flinch. It is so hard to duel against someone with explosive payload because of the crazy flinch it causes. It can also cause sort of visual issues as well, like it's almost blinding sometimes to shoot through someone who has EP. Also, not only that, the EP explosions also don't have a range fall off. Basically, this means that the explosion does the same amount of damage point blank or across the entire map, basically extending your effective range. But wait, there's more. EP can also get some sort of cheeky kills like around corners and stuff if you shoot the floor near people who are trying to heal or hide. This doesn't happen a ton, but it's worth mentioning. So basically, I think Fatebringer is the best hand cannon in the game, really just because of explosive payload. Sort of the way I went about putting this in S plus tier is that I think it's probably equally as good as all of the S tier hand cannons, but explosive payload just sort of makes it a bit better than them, so I wanted to give it its own tier. Next up is Iron Banner's Finite Impactor. Now, I actually really like this weapon. I use it more than I probably should because I'm just going to be honest, it's kind of bad. There is no reason to use it, in my opinion. I just really like it. I don't know what it is. I don't even know why I like it. I'm bad with it too. It's not even like I do well with it. I just like it for some reason. And I think the main reason it just doesn't really stand out is its perk pool. It has really weird perks for a hand cannon. I will always recommend Eye of the Storm, which it gets, so that's good. But the first perk slot could probably be maybe Killing Wind or Firmly Planted. I didn't have access to a Firmly Planted role to test, but I would definitely give it a try if you wanted to use this weapon and had that role lying around. So it's between C and B tier for me. I think I'll put it in C tier, but I do really like using it for some reason, so I could see B tier as well, but if I'm being unbiased, I'd have to put it in C tier. Next is the Judgment from the Prophecy Dungeon. This gun is really cool in my opinion. It has decent stats and decent perks as well. I don't really have a ton to say about it. I don't really like the sights on it, but I'm sure I could get used to them over time. I think the best perks would be Slide Shot or Moving Target for slot 1, and then Opening Shot or Timed Payload for slot 2. Overall, I think it's a solid weapon. It sounds really cool too, not that that matters, but it makes it more fun to use. But there's not really too many downsides to using it, so I'm going to put it in A tier. I could also see B tier as well, but I think if you have a good roll, I could put it in A tier. Nation of Beasts is up next, and this one is, I think, the most disappointing on the list. It has an excellent perk combination in Opening Shot and Explosive Payload. I already talked about how good I think Explosive Payload is, but this weapon just doesn't feel good to use, in my opinion. I think the sights are really bad. I don't like using them at all. Also, it has pretty low range stat, and it just doesn't feel good to use. Probably it's the sights. The sights are very weird. There's not that many perk options, so in theory, it should be easy to get a good roll, but it does require doing Last Wish, which I know is difficult for some and not the most fun. So I'm going to put it in B tier. I think with some slight buffs, either to the base stats or if the sight were better, this thing could be a monster. But for now, B tier. Next up, we have the popular Palindrome. I think Pally just left the Nightfall rotation, but should be back at some point. So Palindrome is a stat monster and also has an Adept version with access to Adept mods. Now I think the main drawback to Pally is that the perk pool is not super diverse. There's really not much to mess around with as far as what perks you should try to get. So in my opinion, the first slot should be Quick Draw. I actually love Quick Draw on hand cannons, but this is the only 140 other than Hawkmoon I think that can get it. So I always run Quick Draw on my Palindrome. You could also go with Killing Wind as well, another solid option. And for the second perk slot, most people would run Rangefinder. Rangefinder's not bad at all. I don't really like it that much because of the extra zoom that you get. And so what I use, and hear me out because I don't think this is super popular, I don't see a lot of people running this, is I use high impact reserves actually. So what this does is it's only like a 3 to 5% damage buff, I believe, which doesn't sound like much at all. It sounds kind of useless, but it lets you 2 headshot and then 1 body shot someone when you're at the end of your mag. So basically you don't need to land 3 headshots, you can land a body shot. So it just gives you some sort of forgiveness with your duels. And honestly, this is super clutch. I can't even tell you how often this comes into play. Because honestly, if you're at the end of your mag anyway, you're probably in sort of a rough situation or sort of a tough spot. You've likely been in a fight for a while or with multiple enemies, and it's just super clutch to be able to land a body shot and still win your fight. Because, like I said, if you're fighting multiple enemies, sometimes it's nice to be able to sort of hit that last shot, and even if it's a body shot, it's okay. You can still win your fight. So, I think high impact reserves is excellent on this, and that's what I use. I use quick draw high impact reserves on mine. So obviously palindrome is extremely good, so I'm gonna put it in S tier. I was considering S plus, but I think Fatebringer still has the edge solely because of explosive payload. So I could see the argument if you wanted to put this in S plus, but I really just made the S plus for Fatebringer because I think it's a bit better, like I said. Next up is the final hand cannon, which is Waking Vigil. It can most easily be obtained from focusing engrams in the helm. Now, I think Waking Vigil has a bit of a niche, and that is because it has very high handling compared to most of the other weapons in this class. Now, obviously this doesn't make it like a godly weapon by any means because handling isn't necessarily the most important stat, but it's definitely very nice and it feels good to use just because it handles so well. As far as perks go, rangefinder and opening shot is a pretty solid roll as always. Or if you wanted to lean into the high handling, you could run surplus if you want. So this was one of the harder ones for me to rank because I think this gun is actually kind of good because of the handling, but overall I think it's outclassed by the A tier weapons, so I'm going to put it in B tier. So that is going to do it for my 140 RPM hand cannon tier list. Let me know what you guys think in the comments. I don't think this should be too controversial or vary too much from what most people think, but definitely let me know if you would change anything. Also, let me know if you want to see a different tier list. I actually have a lot of fun making these. They are kind of hard to put together, but I definitely have fun making them even though they are kind of hard to do. So let me know what list you would want to see next if that interests you. I was thinking of maybe doing a subclass tier list next. So let me know in the comments. I do read all of them. It's hard for me to sort of respond to all of them, but I definitely do read all of them. So definitely let me know. And as always, I appreciate all the support, and I'll see you guys next time.